It's a story of science and politics and community activism and the role of women as they gained a voice in kind of social movements. Long before the women's movement, long before the anti-war movement, it really kind of sits at the epicenter of a turning tide. But it was all based in St. Louis and all believed to be the beginning of a movement, what did become the ecology movement for Barry Commoner and his rise to run for president, and the anti-nuclear movement, which of course continues to this day.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Nina Gilden Seavey, a documentary filmmaker and research professor of history and media and public affairs in both the Department of History and School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Her work has won many awards and multiple Emmy nominations, but it was her film about polio in America which was not just nominated, but won the Emmy. You might recognize her name from the podcast, My Fugitive. In this 8-part series, she looks into the case of Howard Mechanic, who was accused of burning down an Air Force building in 1970. It's not as straightforward as it sounds, and the podcast takes a couple of interesting turns. It will satisfy those of you interested in history, mystery, true crime, and even conspiracy. I'm sure you're wondering, how does any of that relate to nuclear? Well, I've been trying to find someone to talk to about the St. Louis Baby Tooth Survey, which ran from 1959 to 1970. It's not a real well-known study, but it had an impact on ending above-ground testing and serves as a model for citizen science. Nina is a native of St. Louis, and she gave her teeth to science. She has also been looking into this old project and agreed to speak to me about the history, the impact, and even what it was like to participate in the study at that time. I've always wanted to talk to someone about the baby tooth study on the podcast, which explores how science impacts society and society impacts science. So is that the first kind of citizen science project that you've run across?
Absolutely. And it was sort of known as being this outlier where, for the first time, scientists, people like Barry Commoner, physicists, doctors, dentists, obviously, people of both physical sciences and medicine kind of came together and were willing to talk to the public. So for the first time, there was a speakers bureau that would go out to churches and community meetings and to libraries and give talks, believing that educated people would understand what they were talking about. That was almost revolutionary. And so you had somebody like Virginia Brodeen, who ran essentially the study, ran the Center for Nuclear Information. She was not a scientist. Edna Gildhorn was not a scientist. There were a lot of women involved in this who were educated women who'd gone to college, who had very good educations. So, for example, like my mother went to Mount Holyoke. She was one of the women. She ultimately ended up getting her PhD in psychology at Washington University, but that was radically different than most women at the time. But she volunteered for the Baby Tooth Survey, and they would organize meetings and catalog the teeth and sort of do what was necessary for this very important study.
How did the baby tooth study get started?
So in 1958, I'm pretty sure I'm right about that, there had been these rumblings that open air testing was problematic. And it wasn't obviously just in St. Louis. I mean, it was really everywhere that there was this concern that open air testing, that not actually in Nevada and places like that where they were actually doing the testing, but that the prevailing winds were sending nuclear particulates and everything having to do with the explosions over the Midwest. And the Midwest, obviously having a lot of rain, that rain was bringing these particulates down onto the grazing grounds for cattle, and that it was going into the milk, and that it was going into the beef that we were eating. And so there was this concern throughout the Midwest that there was this problem that was not being paid attention to by the nuclear scientists, who were obviously mostly concerned at that time about the Cold War. So to question this, what we were doing was really almost unpatriotic.
And was the prevailing thought at the time that this wasn't a concern? Testing weapons above ground shouldn't concern anyone, or just that it wasn't important because the kind of defeating the Russians was more important than worrying about above ground testing?
It was both. So there
Okay.
was this belief that whatever was going on, which it turns out that they weren't really measuring all that well, but whatever it was within normal limits. But then again, there hadn't been enough science at the time to really suggest what was within normal limits. But everybody was assured that it was okay, that there was not going to be any damage. And people, for example, like Edward Teller, so people who were very, very esteemed were saying, no, 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 it's not a problem. And so there's this belief that we were being told that it wasn't a problem. And on top of it, then the question was, well, if you do voice concerns about it, then that would be un-American because we're behind the Soviet Union, which in fact at that time we were. So that's an actual fact. But, they were moving very, very quickly in their nuclear program. And the United States had been a lot slower after the development of the atomic weapons that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After that point, there had not been as much advancement in nuclear weaponry and building nuclear bombs as there had been in the Soviet Union, who were very driven to catch up with us. So in 1958, 1959, you're starting to see the era of Sputnik. You're starting to see this movement of panic in the United States. And you had over time, over 300, I believe, open air nuclear tests.
And so, why was it St. Louis that decided to look at what was happening with the above ground testing, or what was going on in the air?
So I think it was a confluence of events. One was that St. Louis at the time was an important metropolitan center. And certainly it's been diminished over the years, but a lot of companies built their headquarters in St. Louis: Mallinckrodt Chemical, McDonnell Douglas, Peabody Coal, Monsanto. All of Olin Industries were headquartered there. So it was really a place of tremendous technological innovation. But the other part of it is that Washington University in the post-war period had not had the Jewish quotas that a lot of the East Coast universities had had. So a lot of the scientists who had fled the Nazis ended up in St. Louis. So the Department of Physics and Chemistry had these huge names associated with them. And so the legacy of what was essentially not having the Jewish quotas left this university with this major, major scientific talent. And to be honest, in some ways continues that legacy till today. It doesn't feel like the MIT or some of the other major institutions, Stanford and Caltech and whatnot, but Washington University is a science and medicine powerhouse and always has been. But then you also had people like Barry Commoner. Now, Barry Commoner was a biologist, a botanist, really. And when Barry started to move into the area of ecology and of kind of this science in the public interest, for which he ultimately became the grandfather of the ecology movement and also ultimately ended up running for president. You had this kind of perfect storm of people who were at the university who were very, very politically active. And then one day, Linus Pauling comes to Washington University and he gives a talk at Graham Chapel. There was a moment that was ignited where Pauling goes backstage and Barry Commoner and a bunch of other men, because that's what they were, they create a petition that calls for essentially the end of open air nuclear testing. He's given this rousing talk. I believe, would have to check my notes on this, that this is between the time that he wins the Nobel Prize for medicine and before he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. So if this is in kind of this moment that he's taking control of this message, and he and Commoner and a bunch of others go backstage and they create this petition. And they ultimately get scientists from all over the world to sign it. And it's just like this moment in time that is just, it just ignites. And so it's really a wonderful, you think about watersheds, which I think is a ridiculous and overused term. And you have this moment where this small act, it's a petition. At the beginning, only people from Washington University signed it. But these were also incredibly, incredibly important people in science. And the belief was that we need to start to talk to the lay community. I mean, Washington University is surrounded by University City and Clayton, which are very wealthy suburbs, very white, very Jewish, very well educated. And they started talking to these organizations, to these people. They would go on the radio. Like that was surprising. Like, that meant you weren't talking to scientists. They're talking on the radio and doing interviews with the press. So it was just this kind of confluence in time, this cadre of women, and I was very young at the time. I mean, I was giving my teeth to the baby tooth survey. They were incredibly well educated. They'd gone to the Seven Sisters. They majored in psychology and sometimes in biology. But the doors to higher education for graduate school was not really open to them. So they gave their time to the Center for Nuclear Information, which ran the baby tooth survey. It was just a kind of a quintessential moment in time.
So, what is the Center for Nuclear Information?
So it was the organization that set about bringing together scientists and educated lay people, and they started issuing a newsletter to talk about issues of nuclear information, about questions about the testing. But they also were the organization that ran the baby tooth survey. They had their headquarters in University City on Del Mar Boulevard. It was an educational organization, but they were going to feed this scientific study that was being run out of Washington University Medical School and the dental schools at Washington University and St. Louis University.
Before we move on to the next bit of conversation, the papers Nina is discussing can be found linked on our website, mynuclearlife.com. There are two papers from the 1950s. One is a Nature article requesting an international milk teeth radiation census, i.e., baby teeth, but particularly the front teeth. And the second is a Science magazine article about strontium-90 in man. At the time of this podcast release, both of these articles were open access. Where does the idea of getting this proof come from? So strontium-90 can be found from nuclear weapons, and we know that it accumulates in bones. So where does the idea of gathering teeth come from?
So there had been an article, but I think it was in Science magazine, and it talked about the use of teeth. This was before the study had ever taken place, but the use of teeth for coming to understand questions of exposure. That these baby teeth were the repository of what would be in the bones because they were doing testing, and there had been testing on fetuses that had died. First of all, abortion was illegal, but there were these, fetuses that had been the result of miscarriages. And so they had been able to get some information from the developing bones of those fetuses. Well, obviously, not a large enough sample. This issue of the potential for teeth to give you a lot more information. You could get hundreds and, thousands of them. In that sense, it was like the March of Dimes. It was a patriotic act. And I remember this very vividly. You felt like you were doing something important. Like, you would set your tooth. And this was always a mystery to me because I would put my tooth under my pillow when I lost it. And then I would get my quarter, and then all my teeth always ended up in my mother's jewelry box, which I didn't understand how that happened. But I knew that the teeth had been taken from underneath my pillow by the tooth fairy who'd given me my money, and they would go into my mother's jewelry box where she collected them and then sent them to the baby tooth survey. And then you would get back your button that said, I gave my tooth to science, and we would wear our buttons.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It was a big deal. But that was like, in those days where like you would send your box tops in from your cereal boxes and get like, some kind of a little pin or something like that. And it was a big deal to wear one of your I gave my teeth to science pins.
I mean, that's kind of the genius of this study is involving children.
Yes. And they would come into the schools and they would give you your sign up cards in the schools. I mean, in that sense, it was very much part of the community. There was just this huge kind of outpouring of support for this effort. And I have to say, there was some 300,000 teeth that were donated. Sometimes they would come in from other places, but most of them came from the St. Louis area. They used about 200,000 of them in the study. And then I think my understanding is that you've talked with Mark Weiskopf about what's happening now with those other 100,000. And one of my teeth was in that other 100,000. So I'm actually part of Mark's study.
So you were part of the original study, and now you're part of the re-envision study.
Exactly.
So that must be exciting to be part of the new study too.
Ultimately, I think this is for me, it's blowing up into a much larger podcast with many, many episodes about the science and sort of this history. And I've been collecting interviews from all kinds of people who were in it and, who were involved in it. I found all kinds of interviews that they had done, archival material. So I've been sort of working on this for a while. It's an important story. There's a new book coming out called Left in the Midwest. I have a chapter in it about student surveillance in St. Louis from 1967 to 1970 that I did as a companion to the My Fugitive podcast. But there's also a chapter about the baby tooth survey and the women's role in that survey, in that effort, because it was again, it was very much like the March of Dimes. It was women's activism, but not in the way that we think about it now. But it was very, in that sense, it was women who stayed home with their children and did something that was domestically appropriate.
So very kind of motherly.
Right. It had to do with children and their teeth and finding out what's happening to my children. And the women, of course, were concerned too, because they were drinking the milk because we all were drinking milk because they were pregnant with us kids. And so it was kind of what they were getting was what we were getting in utero. breastfeeding was not really a thing at the time. It was certainly a time when children were bottle fed, but we were eating meat. And certainly we were getting exposure when we were in utero. And maybe within the first month of life, which maybe would have been the time that women would have breastfed.
What did these teeth from the original baby tooth study find? How did that change policy in the US?
So Louise Reese was the head of the study. She published in 1961 an article in Science magazine with the initial results of the baby tooth survey study. And it showed that there were elevated levels. It wasn't the conclusive study, but it was the first reporting on kind of what had been collected over the previous 2, 3 years. One day, doctors Reese and their son Eric were sitting at dinner. The phone rings, and Eric goes and answers the phone, and it's President Kennedy. He says, "Is your mommy there?" And of course, Eric wanted dinner, but he gets his mom to the phone, and she goes upstairs, and they have like a good half-hour long conversation. And he communicates to her that he and Mrs. Kennedy are very concerned because they have children. And within a matter of months after that, you saw the limited nuclear test ban treaty. And that in and of itself is a very, very interesting historical story, but a political story, needless to say. But getting that through again re-raised this question: is this the way we're going to let the communists take us over? Right? Because if we don't do open air nuclear testing and we stop testing and somehow we fall behind, this is, going to be very bad for us in terms of nuclear security. And there's a very, very famous debate between Linus Pauling and Edward Teller, and they go on television, which was very new at the time, and they kind of duke it out. It's a story of science and politics and community activism and the role of women as they gained a voice in kind of social movements long before the women's movement, long before the anti-war movement. It really kind of sits at the epicenter of a turning tide, but it was all based in St. Louis and all believed to be kind of the beginning of a movement, what did become the ecology movement for Barry Commoner and his rise to run for president, and the anti-nuclear movement, which of course continues to this day.
How did this impact you as a child? Did you give any more thought to it besides just, I gave my teeth to science? Was it just kind of all your friends did it?
Everybody did it, but it was like then again, it was like this thing you did. And it was like, you said, "Oh, I sent my teeth in." You wanted to lose your teeth so that you could send them into science.
So it wasn't the quarter. It wasn't like the money.
No. It wasn't. No, it was the button that you got. It was like doing something bigger than you are. And you felt very important, like you were part of something big. And slightly, maybe this was like going to create a little bit of trouble. And that was kind of fun too, because they were going to do this study and things might change. Believe it or not, there was a small core, and still is a small core, of very, very significant progressive movement in the state of Missouri. It was at the time very much built around the university, around Washington University, and it still is. St. Louis City, St. Louis County, close to the university, is still kind of an oasis of liberalism in what is an otherwise very, very conservative state, which it always has been.
I just never thought of WashU and St. Louis in this way. So, I mean, your podcast, My Fugitive, has given me a different look at it, but this has too.
Yeah, I think it's, you tend to, in general, you tend to forget about, in more modern constructs, you tend to forget about the Midwest, with a lot of the work, the real intellectual scientific work going on really on the East and the West coasts. And so you tend to locate it there. But in the days of the acme, if you will, of the Midwest, the kind of work that was going on and still goes on at the University of Michigan, of course, but also at places like Case Western Reserve and Carnegie Mellon and Washington University. Washington University is still a top 5 hospital in the United States, but it just doesn't get that kind of, you don't feel like it's a place of evolution or revolution. Well, at that time, it was the epicenter of it. But that's sort of true for the Midwest.
Yeah. I live in Wisconsin, so Madison is kind of the same way.
And again, those intellectual communities tend to formulate around the universities and around kind of the scientific centers that the universities become, and certainly became in the wake of the Manhattan Project, which was the goal, was that all of that government work would then be transferred to the universities. And that kind of is the legacy of that kind of research. And if you look at the faculty in physics at Washington University in the late 50s and 60s, I think you'd be surprised at the names.
I'm going to have to look at that, because I guess whenever anyone says Washington University, I just always assume they're talking about Washington State.
No. And again, because places like Harvard, Princeton, the really, really good kind of research centers all had Jewish quotas, and Washington University didn't care.
I had no idea. So they capped the number they would take?
Jews, both on faculty and students.
Okay, I'm not surprised, but
shouldn't be surprised, right?
But I shouldn't be surprised. I just hadn't realized it.
But you had what was, kind of this outflow of talent leaving Europe during the rise of the Nazi regime, and all of that accumulated if you take a look at who were the kind of the leaders of the Manhattan Project, it was primarily a lot of people who studied in Europe. And in fact, Victor Weisskopf, Mark Weisskopf's grandfather, was one of those people who led the Manhattan Project.
Did you ever talk about the baby tooth study and what you did as a child when you left St. Louis? Like, did it come up at all when you were an adult?
It didn't. And, of course, I always remembered it. And my brothers and I all did it. So I'll give you this one tip, which is in my podcast that is yet to be on this subject, but your listeners can listen to my fugitive in the meantime. The reason it came back to me and the reason I got interested in it again was I sued the federal government, the FBI, the CIA, the Department of the Army, and the National Archives in the course of doing the My Fugitive Project. And it was a very, very broad lawsuit, hundreds of thousands of pages. And I looked through every single one of those pages. Well, one of the things that I started to find was FBI files having to do with the baby tooth survey.
Why would they care?
I'm not going to tell.
No.
That's for me.
Oh.
But so it's
spoilers.
Actually, it's such a great story. But then all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute. I had to finish My Fugitive, which I did, but I put all of that stuff to the side. And I thought, I'm going to go back to this and start to kind of poke at it a little bit more. Why would they be interested in this scientific study that was run primarily by eggheads and housewives, right? And I found out.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah, it's really fun. So what was interesting was that, I started, getting in touch with people who had been involved in the study, and Barry Commoner's ex-wife she's still alive and was very gracious. She had gone to graduate school with my mother in psychology. So I'd known them from a long time. So a lot of people that I had known about had been friends of my parents. And I started talking to them and started digging out more and more and more material. And then I found out about Joe Mangano, who came into the teeth and, found out that I could find out if my teeth were in there. And I said, so I wrote him an email as soon as I sort of found his email address. And I said, do you have teeth for David Lauren Gilden, Nina Beth Gilden, Daniel Joseph Gilden, and Carrie Wayne Gilden, me and my 3 brothers? And so he wrote back, he said, well, I actually have teeth for David, Nina, and Daniel, but I don't for Carrie Wayne. And I thought to myself, because Carrie Wayne had died when he was 3, prior to the time that he would have lost his first tooth. So I got really excited and then he says, and so there's this new study by Mark Weiskopf. Are you interested? So all of it started to come back to me. And periodically, somebody like yourself who has a specific interest will, contact me. And in the meantime, I found all kinds of great tapes and oral histories and all kinds of stuff because I'm a documentarian. That's what I do.
Yeah, where I'm just a scientist, so I'm coming at it from a completely
Right,
different
exactly, and I think
way.
that's great, and I think that scientists should talk to each other because that's what advances science, but it's not what advances knowledge, if you think about knowledge in sort of the meta way, and I think you need to advance both at once.
That's a great way to say it. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to add?
I think the one thing is that we've become cynical, over-medicated by information. And I think it's really important that your listeners understand just how unique and, again, a word that's overused, in the extreme. But it was a turning point in the sense that scientists very consciously said, we are talking to ourselves about this issue of how does the nuclear revolution affect society, which is really sort of at the kind of engrossed sort of the big issue of this baby 2 survey. And that somehow it came at a time when America was very naive and young, and we believed in government. And we believed that the government would protect us. And this was the first time when scientists and activists started to say, there's something wrong here, and that putting the blinders on is harmful. In that sense, it was a bit of a wake-up call. And of course, the Vietnam War expanded that kind of cynicism, that questioning of authority. But this was before all that. And it was hard. It was hard. The idea that President Kennedy would take it so personally. He hated Khrushchev. And the idea that children would be harmed and that somehow there would be ill effects that would overwrite this question of national security. Now, obviously, they came very quickly with underground testing. So it's not like there was too many missteps in the between, but it was kind of a moment of clarity. And I don't, it was just a simpler time. We didn't have access to information other than what came out of the AEC at the time. And the AEC said it's no problem. So I just feel like you want your listeners to sort of go back and try to take off some of that, the calluses that we have, and try to put yourself in that moment when scientists really did begin to talk to the outside world.
Which they hadn't done before.
Never. Pretty important time.
Okay, we're going to end there. Our next podcast will discuss the future of the Baby Tooth survey. After 50 years, there is actually more that can be done. Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you to Nina for her time. You really should go listen to the 8-part podcast called My Fugitive by Nina. It's really good. If you would like to download the papers mentioned or find more content, head on over to mynuclearlife.com. If you want to send us a comment or question, use mynuclearlife@protonmail.com. To help others find us, please leave a rating or review wherever you are listening to this podcast. Until next time, I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.